Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. I want to thank our 2021 Lunch and Learn series sponsors who helped to make these programs possible: the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund, Home Street Bank, and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. I want to start today by showing you a photo. Richard, will you pull up a photo? Thank you. If I were to ask you, what do you notice in this photograph? You might answer that all of the children are wearing stars sewn onto their clothing. Sitting front and center in this photo, staring straight at the camera, is Peter Metzlar, a Dutch Holocaust survivor who now lives in Seattle. Peter and his mother were some of the few Jewish people from the Netherlands to survive the Holocaust. They found a place to hide with a non-Jewish family on a farm. Peter recalls raids on the farm in which people stormed the house looking for hidden Jews. He and his mom would run into the nearby woods to hide. This photograph and many other photos and precious objects from local Holocaust survivors are part of the Holocaust Center's exhibit, Finding Light in the Darkness. I'm excited to announce that you can now explore our museum and the exhibit virtually. Visitors can interact with embedded testimony videos that feature survivors' stories and explore artifacts that bring history to life. One of the wonderful advantages to visiting the museum virtually is that you can click on an artifact or photograph and zoom in to analyze the detail and see the expressions on people's faces. You can pause the video, rewatch it, or even come back to it at a later time. And you can easily share the exhibit with others, no matter your proximity or ability to get to Seattle. A huge thank you to TPN for generously creating this exhibit for our Holocaust Center. You can find out more and explore the exhibit on our website, and we are also putting a link in the chat where you can enter the exhibit after this program. If looking at artifacts through a museum exhibit isn't enough and you want to take your learning deeper, I invite you to join us on a trip to Poland this summer. For 10 days, you will have the opportunity to explore the places in Poland that are important to better understanding this history. You will hear stories of resistance and meet with people who can tell you firsthand accounts. You will visit historical towns, cultural and memorial sites, and will be accompanied by the most knowledgeable guides. This is not a trip about touring. It is a trip about connecting to people, connecting to the history, and connecting to the present. Registration for the trip is now open, and you can check our website for details, or there's another link in the chat where you can find the information. If you were to travel with us to Poland this summer, you would have the opportunity to visit former Nazi labor camps and death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Plaszow. While these camps have become almost a defining attribute of the Holocaust, the Nazis were not the first to institute and run concentration camps. Such camps have existed for more than a century and were often justified as a measure to protect a nation and have served as a tool for dehumanization and murder. Acclaimed author and journalist Andrea Pitzer has a passion and talent for unearthing lost history. She writes that events and ideas that were once common knowledge, but have fallen from public memory, fascinate her, as does humanity's tendency not to learn from history. Her recent book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps, was listed as one of Smithsonian Magazine's 10 best history books and was called masterly by The New Yorker. Andrea's writing has appeared in many places in print and online, from the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, Outside, the Daily Beast, Vox, and USA Today, just to name a few. She studied at Georgetown University and at MIT and Harvard as an affiliate for the Nieman Foundation for Journalism, and in 2009, she founded Nieman Storyboard, the narrative nonfiction site for the foundation, which she edited until 2012. Before that, she was a freelance journalist, a music critic, a portrait painter, a French translator, a record store manager, and a martial arts and self-defense instructor, but she clarifies that this was not all at the same time. Andrea Pitzer will take questions at the end of the program. Please type in your questions at any time into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today from West Virginia, and we are so pleased to have you as part of this program.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me today. It's an honor always to speak for Holocaust museums and centers. This is such important history to recall. In the interest of clarity, I will say I grew up in West Virginia, but I am right now just outside Washington, D.C. in my home in Falls Church, Virginia. And I'm excited to run through a little bit of this history of concentration camps that I think people typically don't know. And when they first think of concentration camps, Auschwitz for most people is what comes to mind. And I argue that in fact, it is what most people should think of. It's the singular historical moment in which camps were at the heart of human depravity, and it should be the first thing we think of. But hopefully, as I speak today, you'll have additional reasons why it perhaps should be the second and third thing that you think of as well when you think of the camps, but maybe to have a little more of a sense of where they came from and how we got to a place like Auschwitz. I want to start by talking a little bit about what is a concentration camp. And Richard, if you could bring up the first slide, please. So there is some debate among historians between sort of the first and the second set of concentration camps in history, but most people agree that in in Cuba under Spanish rule in the 1890s is when concentration camps under that name first entered the world. And so what did it mean at that time? Concentration camps, actually in Spanish, reconcentración, was the idea of rounding up civilians en masse without trial, preemptively. In other words, they weren't accused of any kind of crime. And in this case, it was for purposes of war, to try to isolate guerrilla fighters from people who might support them out in the countryside. And so the thought went that if you rounded up all the civilians and put them behind a barbed wire, the only people that would be left would be these guerrilla fighters whom you could then kill indiscriminately. And so the very beginning of this idea was pretty horrific right from the start. And that has kind of set the tone for what concentration camps meant for the first several decades. And it was the mass detention of civilians without trial, usually on the basis of identity or political affiliation, sometimes ethnicity, race, racial class, religion, but it is something about who they are rather than anything in particular that they have done or are accused of doing. And so from the beginning, we have that definition, and that's what I used for my book. And it's interesting to note that in Cuba, the man who first sort of put those ideas forward is the Governor General, a Spaniard at the time of the island. He was saying in order to defeat these rebels, it would be necessary to do all kinds of summary executions, but also to institute this policy of reconcentración. But even then, not having any idea that it might lead to something like Auschwitz, even with his own limited ability to imagine where it could go, he said that he would not himself support the institution of such a policy because no one who was a representative of a civilized nation could unleash this kind of suffering and horror on civilians. So I think it's important to note that right from the beginning, this was an idea that it didn't take huge leaps of faith or tremendous insight to understand that it was a monstrous thing to do to other people. The man who was suggested it would be the only way to win himself said he would not apply this. However, Spain recalled him and sent in a general who was already nicknamed the Butcher, who insisted on being able to apply this policy and others at will in order to put down the rebellion. And in fact, more than 150,000 people, which is a tremendous, more than 10% of the population of the island at the time, are estimated to have died from less than 2 years of active reconcentración policy. And those children that you saw in that last slide were people who had been in those camps. They were reconcentrados, and they were freed by Americans who then invaded the island. Unfortunately, the US took hold of most Spanish possessions. And if you could actually go to the second slide, Richard. And at the same time in South Africa, you had the British fighting Boer War, and the conflict there was very similar. They were trying to grab hold of land from people who were rebelling against colonial rule. And in this case, it was Dutch descendants, and it was Black Africans. And both of them were put in two different camp systems. We have a lot more records of the camps that held the white residents, the people who were interned there. It was almost all women and children, and more women and children died in these camps than actually died in combat during that war. If you could go to the next slide. This is in the Philippines, and this is another one of the colonial possessions that the US inherited along with Cuba during the time that we had defeated Spain and we were in this transitory period. There was some question of whether we would give the Philippines independence. And it was decided, no, we wouldn't do that. It started out as a conventional war, it went to an unconventional war. And even though the US president had decried the policy that Spain had in Cuba with the camps as being a monstrous, barbaric policy that would lead to nothing but the wilderness and the grave, the US itself instituted camps in the Philippines not long after the guerrilla war began. If you could go to the next slide. In the same decade, sort of rounding out the four big places that they were used around the globe in their first decade of existence, we have what was then known as Southwest Africa, what is now known as Namibia, and it was a German possession. And the Namo and Herero people rose up against German rule in that time. They were put down mercilessly. And this leads me to an interesting idea, which was this camp, Shark Island camp, was basically an extermination through labor camp. But it's important to say that not all concentration camps rise out of a genocide, and not all genocides rise out of concentration camps. They certainly in the Nazi era were aligned. And here, what had actually happened was that the Germans had put out a death edict, basically to kill all of these rebelling people. And the Reichstag in Germany was so horrified by the bluntness of this, it was an extermination verdict, that they defunded part of the army from doing this. And so then these camps were set up in the aftermath of that genocide and actually achieved some of those genocidal aims even after the official declaration sort of targeting these people for genocide had ended. So the camps can come before a genocide, they can come during a genocide, or sometimes they're even used to sort of perpetuate the goals of a genocide after the genocide is officially ended. And so I want to just take a minute to distinguish between the idea of a genocide and camps, and also to talk a little bit about some of the precursors to concentration camps, because nothing in history springs clean out of nowhere. Of course, there were precursors, and I'm not going to talk a lot about them today, but I do want to take a minute to acknowledge where the roots of the camp lie, where these camps lie. And it basically, the British used policies in the late 19th century of rounding up civilians when it was inconvenient in their imperial ambitions. In more specific ways, the Spaniards in the Spanish mission systems that were established in North and South America would force indigenous and native populations off of land, often into places that were organized and run as missions. They were Christianized, they were sometimes forced to work, their family units were destroyed, and it decimated the societies, not just through disease, but also the social structure of those societies. Later, once North America, part of the colonies were a British colonial possession, and then later when America gained its independence, the use of Native American reservations and relocating Native peoples onto those reservations were all policies that made things like concentration camps possible in the imagination later. And the sort of pivot point that distinguishes the camps from those earlier things, I would say, involve two key aspects, and they're both technology. In one case, in the late 19th century, we see the rise of automatic weapons that are mass produced and can be shipped. So suddenly you have a very small guard force that can have very, very powerful weapons to control a lot of people. In addition to that, where do you hold them? If you hold them behind a barbed wire, then you have a much better chance of keeping them pacified and under control. And barbed wire was patented and went in mass production in the second half of the 19th century. And so suddenly the kinds of things that had taken in terms of dealing with indigenous people in the Americas or in British colonies, it had taken a lot of troops to do previously, did not take nearly as many people to put into effect the same policies by the end of the 19th century. And that is the same moment you see this word concentration camps, you see this phrase emerge. And in that first decade, they were so horrific that worldwide people were denounced for them, governments were denounced for them, they were seen as barbaric, and they fell largely out of fashion. But a really unfortunate moment happened. Richard, if you can go to the next slide. Not just for being the dawn of the concept of a world war, which was in itself horrific enough, but if you can see in this photo, you have barracks. This is a Sunday chapel service, so you can see that there is a reverend ministering under that covered pavilion, and you see these hordes of mostly military age men. Almost everyone who was interned in these camps during World War I were interns that were of military age. And so World War I is this moment when this horrific policy is brought back. And there are a few different reasons for it. It was partly out of desperation. It was thought at first the war might last a few weeks and then a few months, and it dragged on year after year with very little movement in the front lines. And there was a lot of spy paranoia at home, and the desire to simply do something in the war effort was part of what drove this wish to lock up civilians for the first time. So there were many people who had lived in England. Maybe they had been born in Germany and they had been a grocer somewhere in rural England for 30 years. And when the war happened, this spy fever seized everyone, and there was this call to lock people up. And England and Germany at first avoided a lot of the calls for this. But after the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania, which had civilians on it, and that was a few months into the war, this call to round everyone up became really oppressive. And they went not just from doing it to those who had been determined to potentially be involved in spy activity, but there was an idea that you would do it universally. And now we think of World War I today as internment, and that's quite different than a concentration camp. But it's important to realize that in that moment, they were called concentration camps, and they were seen as inheritors of that early policy that were barbaric. And so there was this tremendous desire for them not to be barbaric. There was this tremendous desire to not look like the bad guys, as these governments had looked like the bad guys before. And so what you had was you had lending libraries, you had chapel services, you could sometimes wire money to people who were interns so that they could buy things at what was basically a commissary in some of these camps. Germany ran them, England ran them. And of course, as all these other countries entered the war, many of them adopted these concentration camp policies as well. And don't forget that almost all the big players in World War I were also imperial powers. So you went in 1914 from having almost no camps anywhere in the world to within a year or two having camps up and running with very complex bureaucracies in dozens of countries. By the end of the war, the Red Cross would have visited dozens of countries holding those camps. They would have set up mail service to many, many detainees in those camps. There was a bureaucracy of camps that developed. And because of this wish to not be seen as the perpetrator of atrocities, which was a term that everyone flung at each other in this war in relation to their camps, but no one took it on for themselves. But in this wish to not be portrayed or seen that way, what happened was there were not the kind of death and suffering that we saw before. And it was mostly limited to military age men. And there were some people who tried to escape. There were some accidents that happened. Some of the camps that were closer to the front line had some atrocities in them, but the worst fears of what would happen did not happen. And as a result, the whole concept of a concentration camp was rehabilitated. And so for the first time, people decided maybe these camps as a policy could be a responsible part of government practice for dealing with what they saw as an internal threat from foreigners during wartime. So this idea of the concentration camp was rehabilitated. And of course, internment during World War I does not look anything like what we think of when we think of Auschwitz. However, we have set the stage by this point with some really important factors. And I would argue you cannot get to later camps without those World War I internment camps, partly because they rehabilitate the idea, but also this is where the camp administration and bureaucracy arises. This is where people learn to register with the police. This is where people learn to turn themselves in. This is where people are led willingly away, where they are held indefinitely while they're as a minority in another population, while there is a crisis underway. And at the end of it, they were released. Almost without exception, they were released. So it set the stage for the world in a horrible way, that the camps could be a humane practice, and that at the end, this targeted minority group that was put away would be let back in society and normality would resume again. And without the public coming to accept these ideas, I don't think that you can get to many things that happen later, but especially it's very difficult to get to the early stages of the Nazi camps and then also to the death camps. But during this same time, less on the radar of news organizations in terms of the use of camps, less awareness was in that moment present. But if you could go to the next slide, Richard, simultaneously, there was also the Armenian Genocide. And even though I think that had less influence later in terms of how governments thought about and used camps, it was a policy at this point to basically send these civilian populations, this unwanted minority, out into the desert. And these transit camps were established by which these people could be driven out into worse and worse conditions until they perished or until they were then slaughtered. So simultaneous with the rehabilitation of these camps, with these sort of more model camps being established, we can see the worst of the camps persisting because it's impossible to eliminate the worst that's going to happen. If you do lock up people in this setting, what I have found is that no matter what political system is in, over time, the longer they last, the more horrors can happen. And with the Armenian Genocide, we did see that happen. But after World War I, not all the camps even shut down. This idea of camps, which again is now quite relevant and quite accepted, the British used these same alien laws that were used against foreigners. The idea was you could lock up enemy aliens, and they used those same enemy alien laws to fight to fight Irish independence in British possessions. And so the same rules are used to lock up these Irish independence fighters. And the Soviet Union had not yet been formed at that point. But after the 1917 October Revolution, the Bolsheviks had seized power, and within months, they are literally locking up not, and this is where it's revolutionary in this moment, they are locking up not people who are foreign enemy aliens during wartime, because Germany is not part of the picture. Once they seize power, they sue for a separate peace. The Russians sue for a separate peace with Germany. So they are now not engaged in the war. Instead, they become wrapped up in their own civil war, and they begin using some of these former campsites and the principles of alien internment to lock up targeted classes and groups from their own civilian population. So the big pivot in this moment, when the camps continue after World War I, that is probably most significant, are these early Soviet camps. Before there's even a Soviet Union, we have these Soviet camps, and some of the first ones were set up. This is a monastery on the Solovetsky Islands. It's known as Solovki, and it was transformed into, too many people were escaping from some of the early Soviet camps. And so they did this offshore camp on this monastery in just barely subarctic conditions. And it became sort of the camp of horrors, in which this policy of reform through labor, that forced labor could reform people into being citizens of an ideal new country, that took root. And also the idea of having to earn the food that you eat. So laboring and getting food in proportion to what you can produce. So these early Soviet camps became a key piece of concentration camp history. And I want to emphasize that while the Soviet camps predated the Nazi camps, and in some of the trials that followed World War II, the Germans, the Nazis that were on trial, would use that existence of these Soviet camps to argue that they were not the first to do these things, that there had been horrific conditions done by the Russians themselves. And so what position were they in to smear the Germans over this? I think it's important that we take a second to just think about those World War I camps. And if you can think of the colonial camps I showed you at the beginning as sort of the root ball that the tree of the camps grew out of, if you will, the trunk of them is then those World War I internment camps that almost everybody had. And after that moment, when every major country at that point had a camp system of its own, then no longer do you have the camps directly influencing one another in super causal ways. So the Soviets did not inspire the Nazi camps by any means. They all had that shared trunk that had been World War I internment. And from there, the branches grew out depending on local prejudice, local culture, local law. And you see all these systems coming into being in different ways. So while the Soviet system predated the Nazi system, I want to be clear that the Soviet camps were not responsible for the Nazi camps. Each country developed its own horrific system. But these camps were in place everywhere. They were used in Europe to put the homeless together. Gypsies were held in them in Germany after dusk. Many gypsies could not be in town. They had to report to what were called concentration camps on the outskirts of town. Again, a very different idea than we have today, but this idea that you could pick a minority group and funnel them off from the rest of society was an accepted idea, and it was put into practice in many, many places. However, if you can go to the next slide, Richard, the place that we see them coming into play in the most significant way in history is, of course, Nazi Germany. This is the bunker underneath the camp at Dachau. And just like that monastery I showed you in the photo of the early Soviet camp was sort of the beginning camp, the camp from which everything spoke out. This was not, in fact, the very first camp that ever existed in Nazi Germany, but Dachau became sort of the model for, the training ground for, and the inspiration for many of the concentration camp policies for nearly the first decade of the Nazi concentration camp system. But there were other camps first. I remember that in the dictionary of them that or the encyclopedia of them that the Holocaust Museum here in DC put together, the very first camp was identified as a camp at Nora, the first known camp. And it was just where they happened. It was a former like Air Force training, former air training school. And they just converted it and they put local threats to Nazi power there. So in the beginning, these camps were used to isolate political opponents in the attempt to seize power. And this bunker was instituted later, but Dachau was there as a factory before it had been turned into a camp. And so there were places that were just used like Nora, that first camp, where they were just sort of grabbed up existing buildings that maybe had been decommissioned or factories that were no longer in service, and they shoved people into them. But very early on, in the first weeks of Nazi rule, so we're talking spring of 1933, you quickly have people looking to establish concentration camps as an inherent part of Nazi policy. But it's worth saying that concentration camps had been talked about long before the Nazis came to power. And the way that they were talked about was very interesting. Sometimes I think people look back and see the Nazi project as already full-fledged and put together start to finish before they ever gained power. And certainly the willingness to commit atrocities, the inhumanity, the target of the hatred, the anti-Semitism, all that was already there. But I would argue it took a long time for them to mutate that into the worst things that they would do. And it was having those different models of concentration camps that made it possible to do that. Hitler was talking just literally about a year after the end of World War I. He was talking about putting people in concentration camps. There was a Jewish target he was mentioning in particular. How would he like to be in a concentration camp? And it's easy now when we read that to think he wants to put someone in Auschwitz, but Auschwitz didn't exist at that time. So it's worth talking about what did Hitler mean in those first mentions of concentration camps? And what he had in mind were those camps of World War I. That's what existed at that time. In France, in fact, one of the things Hitler was angry about was that France was still holding some Germans in camps after the end of the war. Internment camps, not Auschwitz, but this was outrageous to these German nationalists that these Germans would still be held after the end of the war. And he wanted the ability to put people in camps to see what it would feel like for them. Now, so who is he talking about and what is he talking about in terms of putting people in camps? It's interesting when you look at some of the early Nazi policy, when they're talking about what they want to do to the Jews, in the Jewish German population, they want to strip it of citizenship. They want to move these people outside of the sort of notion of the human in society, not just for animal barbaric purposes, but for very specific legal purposes. The laws that had been set up that let you put people in camps were these enemy alien laws. And what Hitler wanted to do was to reduce Germany's Jewish population to the status of enemy aliens, which would then allow for this kind of treatment. And so this is a really important, just like the Soviets wanting to imprison their own people, targeting certain groups. This is a really important moment in the development of the camps in Nazi history. This is what Hitler wants to do, but he doesn't have the means to do it right away. And so you have this parallel track that happens for the first 5 years or so of the camps. So we get Dachau, Dachau is established, we get Oranienburg, we get this whole system of camps that begins to grow. But for those first 5 years, it is much more often used to target individual politicians or dissidents. It is used to target homosexuals. It is used to target what were then called gypsy populations, what we would now call Roma and Sinti people. And the widespread mass roundups of German Jews did not happen in this window, but simultaneous to the development of the camps and using them to target these other groups, we have the legal attack on the German Jewish population. And in that, they are stripped of citizenship. You can't own binoculars, you can't own maps, you can't, I mean, it gets worse and worse and worse. You can't be on faculty at a public university, you can't use these parks, you can't use these hospitals. It becomes impossible to actually be not just a citizen, but to be present and fully active in life in Germany if you are Jewish. And so we have the legalistic track and we have the development of the camps. And then what happens at this moment in 1938 is we see them cross. And in November 1938, we just had the anniversary last week of Kristallnacht. And it was this mass organized state terror that also inspired a lot of non-state terror as part of the larger project against German Jews. And of course, in Austria, it was a much broader project. But what we see it doing in Nazi Germany is we see tens of thousands of people detained on the basis of being Jewish during this time. It grows the camps massively and it changes their character. And it's a really critical moment in camp history because a couple things happen. One is that the German idea of what would happen with the Jews for a long time, and it was not out of kindness, it was out of convenience. They wanted to force them out of the country. They wanted to have this Aryan state that they had purged of this element that they said that there was an undesirable element. And what they found was that that element did not leave, that it was still present. And you had this tremendously traumatic event. But even after Kristallnacht, there was not the mass exodus that they had expected, that the Nazis expected in the wake of such a thing. And the other thing that happened was the world did not react in any effective ways. And the Nazis learned that this would not be simply a matter of scaring German Jews into leaving the country, and the world didn't care. The world was not inclined to accept these people as refugees. The world was not inclined to intervene. And this, I believe, empowered them, the Nazis, in tremendous ways to begin to use the camps for much more harmful and nefarious purposes. But it is interesting to note, even in this moment, they have not thought of the worst things that can happen with the camps, because more than 90% of those people, those German Jews that were rounded up for Kristallnacht, were actually released in that next year. So almost all of them. Now, again, there were many horrific things that happened. There were many people that died. There were many psychological and physical casualties of the camps, but more than 90% of those people, the tens of thousands of people who were arrested, were released. The Nazis 4 times still had this policy of trying to force German Jews out of their borders. And that population was only about it's estimated 1 to 2% of Germany's pre-war population. So it's a very small number. What happens in 1939 is we get to this, the invasion of Poland and the splitting of it through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And suddenly Germany is now rolling through places in Poland that do not have 1 or 2% Jewish populations. Some of them are majority Jewish. They have so many more people to deal with in terms of managing this Nazi fever dream of managing the Jewish populations that they would rule over. And they themselves are discussing things like Native American style reservations, work and labor camps, that people will be just sent off to the east to do work and labor. And it is out of all of these discussions, as they are rolling through, they have all of these prisoners of war, they have all of these Jewish prisoners that they have taken, and they have no effective plan for it. I believe it's the world's indifference, the nearly decade-long period that they had to establish these early camps and then to strip the legal status of Jews so that when the time came, they would be able to funnel this whole community directly into the camps. This legacy of World War I, in which people learned to register themselves, to turn themselves in, to hope that maybe they might have to do some forced labor, but surely at the end they would come out. I think that this whole rhetoric from before and the camps, the reality of the camps of World War I, worked against the knowledge that was coming out of even the worst of these camps before the final solution was even adopted. There were still horror stories coming out of places like Dachau, coming out of Ravensbrück. There were many, many horror stories, but there had been horror stories during World War I too of atrocities, and many of them turned out not to be true. I think people were very reluctant to accept the early atrocity stories coming out of the Nazi camp system, thinking perhaps it was a replay of World War I. And so for far too long, the world let that camp system develop. The world gave the Nazis a pass, even as we condemned camps, even as noises were made, they weren't seen for what they would become. And I believe that not even the Nazis thought of using, for the first time, camps at the heart of a genocide. As I mentioned before, they were sometimes adjacent, sometimes they can occur in the same place. But when we reached 1942 and this idea of using not just the typical concentration camp system that had already been in place, that with the advent of World War I, when all these prisoners were funneled into it in 1939, became already horrific and degraded in new ways. So we had the first years of the camps, then we had the wartime camps, which became even more horrific. Now, on top of that system, there is a deliberate choice by Nazi Germany to build an extermination camp system. And this is where we come back around to this idea of Auschwitz. And this is Auschwitz-Birkenau. If you have not been, this is a place you will go if you go on the trip. It was the site of the most significant murders at Auschwitz. And again, keep in mind that the genocide against the Jewish people in Europe started before the establishment of Birkenau here, Auschwitz-Birkenau, as the death camp. That genocide began with mass graves and ditches and mobile vans, but the Nazis used this camp system that they had in place to perfect this horrific idea of mass death and efficiency that's been depersonalized, that's less traumatic for the guards, less traumatic for the people running the camp, and allowed them to kill the most people in the most efficient way, even going against, and this is how sick the whole, it's still inconceivable, of course, the horrors of it all, but how sick it became was that even when they were working against their own war goals, in other words, increasing their chances of losing ground or losing the war, they remained dedicated to this project. And the concentration camps, for the first time, became the site in which it was possible to do this. So there's a long road leading up to these Nazi death camps, but even the methods that were used in this camp were often tried in other camps before the death camps existed to eliminate, whether it was people with mental disabilities or physical disabilities, whether it was other targeted populations, Soviet prisoners of war. Almost all the death techniques that were tried out in various death camps, extermination camps, had been tried in prior camps. So without those pre-existing camp systems, without those additional years for the Nazis to try to move more aggressively, more horrifically, and devote themselves fully to their anti-Semitic mission, I don't think that you can get to a place like Auschwitz. We have never come back to that place since, although these camps, of course, as a whole, did not disappear at the end of World War II. What happened in a good way was that Auschwitz became, as it is today, the thing we first think of, the thing we most recognize as a concentration camp. And that's really good, and that's an important thing. But what it also did was to sort of reset the bar, and anything short of a million fatalities, anything short of a death factory, suddenly no one referred to as a concentration camp anymore. And we lost that whole knowledge of what this had been able to rise out of and where it came from. But after the war, we saw the same styles of camps to a lesser degree, not necessarily a genocidal degree, taking place in the world. In the US, in the allies from the war, other than the Soviets, we saw many camp systems used to try to put down independence movements in Algeria, in Kenya, in Vietnam. And in terms of sheer numbers and horror, the largest camps ever established took root in under Soviet influence during the Cold War. There were camps in Eastern Europe, the camps in China, millions and millions of people like held in those camps and forced to do forced labor. And we see the legacy of all of these things even today in places like Xinjiang in China with what they're doing there, in North Korea, which is still running concentration camps. So I think Auschwitz is a singular moment that we need to keep in mind and understand. But I think we also have to realize the dangers that can face us around the world from other camp systems that are not yet at a place like Auschwitz. And given that particular anti-Semitism and historical moment, maybe we will never move back to that place. But I think it is very dangerous for us to pretend like that's not even a possibility. And so I would just like to sum up by saying Auschwitz should be the first thing that you think of, but Auschwitz was the only one of the death camps that had previously, and while it was a death camp, continued to be part of the regular concentration camp system. So it existed before Birkenau became a death camp. Auschwitz I, the camp, already existed. And so it's that memory, not just of Birkenau, but of Auschwitz I and where that Auschwitz camp complex came from, that I hope I can leave you with today, to think about the roots of that and where it can rise from, because it doesn't just rise out of nowhere. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. There was so much information in that presentation. I want to start with a question that came early on from Greg, and this is about one of the photos you showed at the beginning. And he says, do you know any of the specifics of this World War I internment photo, where and whom it shows?
It is, I would have to pull it out of my book, but it is a British camp. And so it is showing Germans that are being held, that are celebrating a Sunday service. But I would have to look up, it's not a camp you've ever heard of. I mean, one of the things that was extraordinary to me in researching this book was even with the Nazi camps, the number of the sheer numbers of people that were held. So even in World War I, it is estimated that at least 800,000 people, likely more than 1 million people, were held in barracks behind barbed wire. And that doesn't even begin to encompass the people that were forced into village exiles. So that camp was run by British military. It would have had German officers that would have been nominated to sort of be running the daily roll calls and the different activities, and to supervise the German, not soldiers, I'm sorry, let me make that clear, military age men, because again, concentration camps are different than prisoner of war camps. So these were soldier potential, but these were not enlisted men. These were not anyone who was actively serving. The difference between a POW camp and a concentration camp, and it's worth underlining that, because we saw some of the horrors that would arise later with concentration camps we saw in the US Civil War, but they were prisoner of war camps. And people had written already quite a bit about those prisoner of war camps. So when I wrote this book, I wanted to specifically focus on the civilians. But interestingly, that camp looks like it could be a POW camp because the way that humanitarian rules and Red Cross Geneva Conventions had been formed at that point, nobody had come up with what do you do with civilian detainees? And so generally they were billeted with the same rights, with the same conditions that military POW camps dealt with, because that was the only model that they had. So it looks a lot like a POW camp because it's effectively being run like a POW camp. But instead of being run along a front line, or near the action, there were some of them that were in London. There were some of them on the Isle of Man. They were spread throughout the capitals of Europe, through the small towns of Europe. They dotted the entire European countryside.
There's another question that comes from Mark, and he asks, can you share your thoughts on the US World War II Japanese American camps?
I treat those camps as concentration camps. I think that given that World War I internment was called concentration camps when it was happening, and I was trying to go with the original roots of what that term had come out of, the Japanese American internment, I frame in my book as a concentration camp internment. It's interesting, as I said, the sort of branches that form from that original tree of World War I internment that legitimized the practice for everybody. It plays into local history and local culture. And in the US, the times we have had things like that, and I would put some of the border actions that we did in recent years that would be in that same category. It is almost always a question of who has the rights of citizenship. That idea of enemy alien, of who is an alien person and who do we get to call an alien person, almost always in the US has affected who gets put into camps. So slavery is its own separate thing, because the idea there was not to remove a group of people from society, but to actually take them out of their society and use them as forced labor in your society. But you still have some of the models of detention and punishment, and so slavery has some echoes, but it's a little different. But if we say slavery to some degree, but then especially look at Native American reservations, Japanese American internment, US border enforcement, the idea of who gets the rights of citizenship. And remember that more than 2/3 of the Japanese Americans that were interned were American citizens. And effectively during the war, we said, you aren't really citizens. Even though you have citizenship, because of your ethnicity, we are going to treat you as non-citizens because we're in a war. And so this idea of when does citizenship count? Are Native American citizens or not? They were denizens in the original language of the constitutional rights. They were called denizens, not citizens. And so I think that in the US, it's always important to look at that question of who gets counted as a citizen and who doesn't. And our laws usually are willing to be bent to detain even civilians that we have decided that we're going to withhold this idea of citizenship from.
That's very interesting. And actually, that's a good segue into a question that came from Francis, who, and this might even tie a bit with citizenship. And Francis asks, you haven't mentioned how the US prison system, which impacts Blacks unproportionally, functions as a concentration camp system. Would you talk about this?
Sure. One of the hardest things about my book was that it actually ties into so many other things. And so I wanted to kind of address all of them, but you have to put boundaries around the book in some form. So in my introduction, I actually have a whole long paragraph in which I talk about related phenomenon that are like camp adjacent that I can't get to in the book because I'm doing more than 100 years and 6 continents. And I wanted to pick the most influential forms of things that rose with this like very clear model of concentration camps. But certainly African-American incarceration in the US is something that we have to consider when we're looking at this bigger issue, because the difference normally between a prison system and camps is this idea that there's some kind of trial and that you don't have a group of people rounded up on the basis of what it's thought that they've done rather than something that they have done. And even though the US prison system ostensibly works on the basis of trial, we have Khalif Browder who died by suicide, but after such a long detention in which he was never given a trial, right? He was eventually released, but after a horrifically long detention, which he did not have a trial. There are many, many people that are being held without trial. I went to Guantanamo, for instance, for the book as well. And the question of what happens if you don't get a trial, is a big issue. And so if there's not a trial, and if you have in a given geographical area, a huge percentage of a given ethnicity or racial group that has been detained on suspicion on various things without the trial, then that starts to look much more like a camp model and much less like what a real true prison model looks like. So I think that absolutely there are overlaps there. There are questions that have to be asked, and you can't probably remove a concentration camp system entirely without also looking at how are you running the penal system. And many people trot out that we actually have higher rates of incarceration in the US now than in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And so I think you can't just ignore those things. You can't be glib about it. It's not exactly the same, but there's really important roots that we, I think, in the US need to talk about that we are not discussing.
That's interesting to see the overlaps there. Very interesting. Another question comes from Rob, and he asks, did the US military have any deep understanding of the camp system prior to liberation?
That is a fascinating question. And I think it's one that we both know the answer to, and we don't know the answer to. So I'm going to give you both answers, which is that in Europe, so the Allies, Jan Karski, if you may have heard of him, I went to Georgetown. He was actually a professor at Georgetown. He sneaked into a horrific camp and then was smuggled out and brought into the West. He spoke to Supreme Court justices. He spoke to Roosevelt. He spoke to Allied leaders in other countries. And there was basically a response that they didn't believe he was lying, but they couldn't believe that it was all true. And there were other reports that were brought out, and there was some suspicion maybe the numbers were too high, when actually the numbers were fairly accurate in many cases in terms of who was being executed and that exterminations were happening. And so I think that there was this mix. At first, as I said, it was thought that it was more like the atrocities from World War I, that maybe things were exaggerated or they weren't getting the whole picture. And then I think there was the idea that, well, maybe a lot of these people really were being sent to just forced labor in the East. They weren't necessarily being exterminated. But we also had very clear accounts from people who were eyewitnesses. And there was a wish to not believe that this was possible. And I don't want to be too sympathetic to that because the world waited far too long to act. But even myself studying this today, it is still incomprehensible, even knowing everything that we know now, that humans would do this in such a sustained and systemic way, not just in anger, not just in a single battle, but as a matter of policy, as a matter of committed extermination to another group, that no wonder they probably struggled to understand it in that moment. But we can look back and see, who did they give the benefit of truth to? Who did they give the benefit of the doubt to? And almost consistently, it was toward inaction. And now we've seen the cost of that kind of inaction. So they had complex plans. They were wondering, should they bomb some of these camps? Literally, would they save more lives if they ended the capacity to have people held in these places? Would that take away from the war aims? So they knew enough to know where some of these places were and that absolutely horrific things were happening. And yet, from all the reports we have, as the US is streaming through these camps, liberating them, going from one to the next, hardened generals were throwing up and unable to go in places where there had been functional morgues in these camps. It was a kind of thing that even battlefield devastation could not prepare them for. So they both knew and should have done better. And it was still inconceivable as we can imagine today.
So Andrea, lots of questions have come in all kind of around the same theme. And so maybe I'll pose this to you as kind of our concluding question. And that is, we know camps exist today in different parts of the world. What can we do knowing these camps exist, and how do we prevent this from continuing?
So I think that there's a few things. I think every camp system, I told you at the beginning that Cuba is regarded by a lot of people as the first camp system. Those British camps in South Africa, the camps for the Boers and Black Africans, everybody agrees those were definitely concentration camps. But even when there's only those first two examples to compare, the British said in Parliament, in their discussions right from the beginning, our camps are nothing like those camps. These people deserve it. And so I think the first thing to say for ourselves is, whether it's your country doing it or another country doing it, every country has believed that, has had a number of citizens who believe, and has had a power, governing power, that has said that this kind of civilian mass detention without trial is somehow different. So I think first, to resist the impulse to look to your own interests in a way that let you redefine it. So don't let anybody get away with saying these camps are different. They are in fact all unique, but there is inherent serious danger anytime you do this, no matter what political system you're in. So that's the first step. The second step is, to educate yourself a little bit. There are Rohingya held in Myanmar in camps still, and across the border in Bangladesh. There are camps in the western state of Assam in India. There are European camps of migrants that have fled violence in Syria and elsewhere that are pretty horrific conditions, that some people are starting to question how long will they be there, what's going on. So learn about some of these systems and let your elected representatives know that they're a concern for you, because they can maybe make policies that will affect that. I would also say, in terms of the countries that are involved, or even with it in the US, let's say with border detention, often what keeps camps from being established long-term is if there is an independent and strong judiciary. So support the organizations that help secure like civil rights and civil liberties for people, even if it's not always people you agree with. The more we have independent courts that keep individual human rights around, the more that organizations can promote those around the world, the more our elected representatives know that's a priority for people in the country. I think that those are all steps that just about anybody could take on. Of course, there are more complex things. If you're a historian, if you're a lawyer, there are lots of other things you can do, but anybody can do the things that I just mentioned.
That is great advice. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for this very powerful and dense presentation with lots of information. I think will give us all a lot to think about, and hopefully to better recognize these types of things as they come up and give us the tools to take action when we see them. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you for having me here today. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's been joining in on today's program. This program was recorded and you will find it on our website starting tomorrow. Programs like these are possible because of the generous support from our donors. And if you found today's program interesting, please consider making a donation to help support more programs like this one. You can make your donation quickly and easily on our website, and you'll find the link in the chat in a moment. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show. Also, thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and to our entire team, Lori Warshall-Cohen, Jenna Sittman, Paul Regelbrug, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, and Devonshire Lockey. Please join us for our next program on the first Tuesday of December, December 7th, for the third program in our winter series, entitled Searching for Survivors, the Fate of the St. Louis Passengers with Scott Miller, author and founding member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The story of the St. Louis has become a symbol of America's indifference to the plight of Jews during the Holocaust. The fate of the ship's passengers, however, remained an unsolved mystery for over 60 years. Scott Miller will discuss his decade-long search to uncover the fate of every passenger on board this famous and fateful journey. Thank you again for joining today's program, and we look forward to seeing you back here on December 7th. This concludes our program for today.